Good afternoon. I'm Jess Stein. I'm a senior, I'm the Senior Licensing and Business Development Officer at Cornell University. I manage the plant portfolio for the university. I am delighted to say that we have an excellent panel here for you today. We will have panelists here that include the Commissioner of Agriculture, Mr. Ball. We have Jim Prevor and Brad Rickard. I am giving it just a few more seconds here to let some other people join if they're going to join. Some housekeeping items I want to let you know about. We are asking our audience members to please use the Q&A chat, Q&A rather than the chat, so that we can make sure that we get all of those questions answered. And I'd like to, we've got a few more people coming here. Good. Welcome. I'd like to give a brief introduction of Jim Prevor. He is the founder and editor-in-chief of the Produce Business Magazine. Welcome. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Jess. I appreciate that. It's a great pleasure to be here and part of this, and especially to introduce our keynote speaker, Rickard Ball, Commissioner of the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets. And of course, it's typical in these things to give a list of accomplishments and awards and life story. But we only have an hour total, so I can't even begin to list his accomplishments and life story. Just before the pandemic, the commissioner was up at Cornell at Statler to receive the 2019 Friend of Extension Award in honor of his really substantial contributions to encouraging the Cornell Cooperative Extension Program. But his real interesting life story, and I've known the commissioner for a long time, is this narrative. He started out working on his grandparents' dairy farm, milking cows, and apparently acquiring a love for agriculture and for food. He went off at 18 to a Rhode Island vegetable farm, where he went on to climb the ranks, if you will, and he became the operations manager of the farm, and then realized a lifelong dream of becoming a farm owner of a 200-acre farm in New York State, where they're not only a grower, but a retailer with the Carrot Barn store on the thing and on the farm. What's really interesting, he has just this incredible lifetime engaged in community and service. Vice President, New York State Vegetable Growers Association, the Board of Directors and Chairman of the Labor Committee for New York Farm Bureau, past Chairman of the Labor Committee of the American Farm Bureau. He's been representatives for his county on the Mohawk Valley Regional Economic Development Council. He's been the board of directors on his county and past president of his county farm bureau. Deeply involved in a nonprofit that was formed to help the recovery effort after Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee, and chairman of his Chamber of Commerce, of his county Chamber of Commerce. Even now, it's really astounding, and I've been fortunate to meet about 45 of our state's commissioners of agriculture or secretary of agriculture at different states. But even now, as commissioner, he finds the time to be president of Food Export Northeast, helping our agricultural community find markets overseas, second vice president for NASDA, the National State Departments of Agriculture Association. These are all things, and there are 100 others that are well recorded. You could go and read all about them. I just want to share before we jump into the program, my own little story with the commissioner, which is when he got appointed, I was fortunate to engage with him and have a conversation because we run something called the New York Produce Show and Conference in Manhattan. And the first words he said to me about this conference, and he's been very generous with his time, keynoting it, cutting the ribbon, really engaged in every way. And the first thing he said was, how can I help you? How can I help make this event a better and greater one? He said right away, he saw the potential to use the event at the Javits Center to make it a sort of epicenter of the produce world. And he wanted to help farmers find markets, retail markets, food service markets, wholesale, processing, export. And he said to me, we can help retailers and restaurants sell more by introducing them to new products, sources of supply, providing education, and we can bring global buyers into New York and into America. And so I learned personally and sort of up close and personal what really defines Commissioner Ball. And it was intelligence, it was interest, it was engagement, it was a desire to make things happen. And I've worked with many commissioners in many states, their equivalent overseas, and I can tell you that here in New York, we have a very rare one who wants to contribute and one who wants to and is able to make things happen. I personally have gained so much from his insight, and I know we all will today by listening, engaging with Commissioner Ball today. So I want to thank him for coming and let him take the floor.
Wow. Well, thank you, Jim. That was, you may have overshot the mark a little bit there, but it's much appreciated. And it's so great to see you, at least virtually again, and listen to your voice. And, what a great partner you have been with the New York Produce Show and all the history. Jim, you've been a walking encyclopedia, a walking family reunion of everyone who has anything to do with the produce industry, both here in the United States and in Europe, I think. And your insights are pretty keen about the industry, and your history goes back so far. So thank you for your partnership. Looking over at Bradley also, Brad, I can remember meeting you for the first time, I think at the Becker Forum at Cornell, was helping to put on about, connecting the dots in a broad way to our food system. And it's really heartwarming for me to be a part of this conversation here today, because that's a lot of what we're talking about here. You talked about my history a little bit, and yeah, I fell in love with ag as a 7-year-old, I guess. And I was fortunate as a kid to know what I wanted to be when I grew up. I wanted to be a farmer, and working in the industry, getting a job on a farm, learning it from literally the ground up, and the pun was intended there. Finding the optimism after 20 years, finding the wherewithal to confuse a banker a little bit and buy our own farm, which is what it takes. And today having an operation that we got about 50 employees and a couple hundred acres, and we've had the good fortune to send product into the New York City area, the Boston markets, and wholesale, and to the restaurant trade, and to also have our own farm market on the farm today. And although I'm technically a first generation farmer, because my grandparents sold the farm out from under me when I was about 10, today I'm happy to say we have 3 generations on the farm, and very excited about our future in New York. I want to just take a minute to say, kind of the reason why I get a chance to be here today is, I'd spent 20 years learning how to farm, I had spent 20 years building Schoharie Valley farms up. I was pretty sure the next 20 needed to be spent figuring out how to transfer to the next generation, and also think about the viability of the next generation. And that's when my phone rang, and it was the governor's office asking me to take on this role. I wasn't really sure that it was something I would do or want to do, but I got to tell you, I'm here because of the conversation I had with the governor. And it revolved largely around connecting the dots. New York State is such a blessed state. We have great resources. We have access to water. We have the best land grant system for ag education in the United States. We have some of the best farmers in the country. We have a great knowledge base. We rank in the top 10 in over 30 commodities. We figure in every national conversation about agriculture. And we also get to live and work and farm right next door to the largest marketplace in the world, the most marvelous and diverse marketplace anywhere. So the opportunity to connect the dots is what the governor and I spoke about. One of the first things he asked me to do, in fact, was to put on an upstate downstate summit. You know, look at what the market of possibilities were in the metropolitan area, and look at where we had the resources and the capacity to fulfill that. So it's been a passion of mine to see that connection happen in a bigger way at a time when probably the divide between upstate and downstate, urban and rural, has never been more stark. Here's a great opportunity to connect dots. So that's really why I'm here today, and I'm honored to be in your company, certainly. I'm thinking about COVID-19 and how that really shone a very bright light on so many parts of our food supply chain. It certainly disrupted our professional lives, and it disrupted our personal lives, and it disrupted our social lives, but it really disrupted the food supply chain in a way that we had not seen prior to that. I think for us at the department, it was a matter of initially, how do we keep things moving? How do we keep the supply chain going? How do we make sure that people have access to food? And for our farmers in New York State, you know, about 50% of what we produce goes to the food service world. Goes to restaurants and institutions and schools. How do we keep and find a new route for all that product to go someplace? How do we keep our food manufacturing facilities open? When someone tests positive for COVID, how do we not shut down the entire plant, whether it be a food manufacturing facility or a dairy processing plant or whatever? How do we keep that going? It was never that we didn't have enough supply. We always had enough supply, and certainly there was a lot of demand in new places. So how do we keep that moving? How do we get it to where we need to go? So for a little while there, I felt like we were the department not of ag and markets, but of ag and guidance, because we were constantly working with Department of Health, working with the state agencies about how can we provide guidance on how to keep going and keep moving. I'm going to use an example that's not from the produce world, but because it was in the dairy world, but it was so symptomatic of what happened in the produce world. One of our largest dairy cooperatives in the state, you know, think back to the early weeks of the pandemic. And week one, they diverted 300 tractor trailer loads of raw milk away from a cheese plant, away from a powder plant, and back to a fluid milk bottling plant because the demand in the grocery store shelves was so dramatic. 300 trailer loads. A week later, they redirected 120 trailer loads of milk back to a fluid bottling plant to try to keep up. And the third week, we began dumping milk. The silos were full and all the dairy plants, the warehouse shelves were jammed up, trucking was jammed up, and yet we still had people who couldn't access protein, couldn't access fresh fruits, vegetables, dairy products, potatoes, onions, carrots, you name it. And yet we had farmers with no place to go with product that was stacking up in their coolers and in their storage facilities. And so what do we do about that? How do we get the supply, which we have adequately, to a new place in the marketplace? We had grocery stores in New York City that had trouble. They were going to close down because they didn't have enough workers to be able to stock the shelves. We had to deal with that. We found workers, we found people, we got volunteers, we got people redirected down to keep stores open so the supply could keep going. And I remember we went to the governor and said, we've got issues. We've got farmers dumping product, farmers with no home for their apples, potatoes, onions, and carrots. And we have people that don't have access to food. And so within 1 week, we set up the Nourish New York program, where we identified $25 million in emergency Department of Health food spending. We were able to, within a week, distribute that funding to our 10 regional food banks. And I remember being on the phone with the 10 regional food banks at the end of that week, and with the Department of Health and the governor's office, talking about how the contract, when we got off the phone call, would be in their email box, that the funds had been allocated according to their demands. They would have the money deposited in their accounts on the following Monday, and how on Sunday, the Department of Agriculture would be reaching out to them to find out how they wanted the product, whether delivered directly to their warehouses in the traditional sense, whether they wanted directed to a distribution event in their region, or whether they wanted to use a voucher system to distribute to their clients to use on purchasing products in their areas and in their grocery stores. And we set that up in a week. That Sunday we were in contact. On Tuesday we had trucks on the road. And 2 days later I was able to be on Long Island in the largest food distribution event by Long Island Harvest in their history. And we did thousands of events after that. We distributed 21 million pounds of food across New York State to participating with 4,000 farms in connecting them with their food banks, and helped out more than 1 million families across New York State. It was a great example of coming together and working hard to figure out how to connect dots. We're still doing that. We extended the program last November to get us through the end of the year, and this year we'll add another $50 million to the Nourish New York program to keep that running. And such a great example of how when a bright light shone on our food supply chain, we were able to figure out some of the missing links and help to fill those in. So with that, I'm just going to say I'm really excited to be here and much appreciative of this opportunity, and kind of anxious to get to the question and answer section and have a dialogue with everyone. So thanks so much for this opportunity. Really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, Commissioner Ball. That was really nice kickoff, and I have to say I'm really honored to be on this panel with both the Commissioner and Jim Prevor. And up next, we're going to have Jim Prieber give some comments and some thoughts. He is, like Jess said, he is the CEO and editor-in-chief of the Produce Magazine. He also carries a similar title for other magazines related to cheese and deli and floral products. In addition to those widely subscribed industry-oriented magazines, he's also been organizing trade shows in New York, other places around the world, bringing buyers and sellers of produce together. And Jim, he regularly speaks and writes about some of the most pressing issues facing food and agricultural supply chains, issues from the farm to food manufacturing, to retailers, to restaurants, to consumers. I'm hoping he's able to touch on some of these linkages as it relates to COVID today. He's also very well known for his perishable pendant, which if you don't subscribe to, I encourage you to do so. And I think that really showcases perhaps one of Jim's greatest strength is just he's just such a quick study. He has such a wide knowledge and vast experience thinking about these critical issues in fruit and vegetable markets. He just is able to sort of quickly digest and understand some of these really difficult questions. And then he also has the capacity to ask the right questions, which I always look forward to conversations with Jim about these pressing issues. So I'm going to turn it over to Jim and give him the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Brad. Really appreciate that. It's a great honor to be here in such illustrious company. But this has been something very interesting. We launched produce business in 1985, and my entire life I've been in produce with so many involvements by my family and going back many generations. But though we've been through wars, recessions, depressions, I have to say there's never been anything quite like what happened last year. And really for the produce industry, it quickly became a tale of two cities with dramatically different experiences on the retail and the food service side. There was, of course, a complete and total collapse of the food service market. In general, most of the statistics show that consumers spend more than 50% of their food dollar on food service, restaurants, and things like out of home. And about 25% of all produce runs through those channels. And instantly, virtually all restaurants closed. And only gradually were they able to build up their takeout and delivery options. There were a lot of sort of positive things happening under the venue of all this. There was a lot of innovation. Many distributors who suddenly lost all their customers began doing direct delivery to homes. Programs like the New York State program, Nourish New York, and also on a national level, the United States Department of Agriculture began a variety of charity box programs. Certain sectors, of course, sustained and even grew: hospitals, nursing homes, prisons, that they had to continue to get fed even while restaurants were closing. And there was an explosion in the delivery services, the delivery dudes and Uber Eats and things of this sort. But although at the same time restaurants were collapsing, retail was booming, with retailers generally reporting the highest sales they'd ever experienced, sometimes increases of 100% or more. But for produce, this was somewhat challenging still, because the food service and retail sectors use different items. They use different sizes. They have a different supply chain. About 80% of the produce that's used in food service is only 4 products: potatoes, lettuce, onions, and tomatoes. Whereas at retail, that's a much smaller percentage. So it became almost impossible to figure out how to redirect all of that volume that would have gone into restaurants into the retail sector. And even within that, there's different usage. You have very large baking potatoes and things that are used commonly in steakhouses and things like that, just aren't used as commonly by consumers. So in fact, across the country and around the world, there was a lot of distress in the food service supply chain. There was product that was disced under. There were lots of companies that didn't make it. And there was this general scramble to build new supply chains. How could companies that had traditionally supplied only the food service sector find a way into retail sector? And retail needed it because there was really this boom at retail. For a month after this started, there was no way to supply enough produce, and retailers had difficulty because produce actually had a lower increase, fresh produce, than many other items at retail. So there was a great challenge because consumers afraid of how long this would take, when they could get back into the store, maybe afraid of going to retailers, shifted to canned and frozen items, really hurting the sale of fresh. And there was also, as this went on, a change. Although the initial month, anything that a supermarket could get in, they basically were selling, that began to moderate a lot with fresh produce. People began to feel, well, maybe I'll be able to come back. And therefore, they didn't want to stock up as they had on their canned goods and frozen items. There also seemed to be a dip in usage of certain items. When a consumer goes out and goes to a restaurant and orders a hamburger, they're probably going to get lettuce, they're going to get tomato, they might have an option to get a slice of onion, they'll have a pickle, they'll have coleslaw, they'll have fries, but not so much at home. These are things have to be put together. I have teenage sons, and I can tell you, while dad was working and mom was doing things, they were somehow left alone to feed themselves. And, you know, they ate the burgers, but they weren't preparing all the side items that they would have gotten had they gone even to their school cafeteria where they're serving these things.
Pardon me, Jim.
Sure.
In the interest of time, I'm going to ask that Brad begin.
Okay.
Yeah, or if you wanted to finish your thought there, Jim, that would be that might help segue into my.
Sure,
Sure.
please.
Sure. I mean, the basic point was that there's this tale of two cities where on the retail end of things, there was this giant boom, at least for a short term, but the total collapse of food service and a difficulty in the industry of moving product from the food service sector into the retail sector. And that in the end, when the retailers had to deal with this, they actually did not have the capacity to handle that produce supply chain. And so we began a redevelopment of taking companies like Baldor in New York, began supplying retailers for the first time in its experience. And it's that transition that has been created through this time period.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jim. That helps me actually, I think, segue into the slides. I have some slides here that I'm going to share with us. Can you see those, Jess?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. My name is Bradley Rickard. I'm an associate professor in the Dyson School. And I'm an economist, and I've been writing a few papers over the last year, specifically about the impact of COVID on fruit and vegetable markets. And I can share any of these with anyone. There's a couple of examples here, one with the title explicitly looking at COVID on fruit and vegetable. This is one that we wrote just recently, and we labeled it as 1 year later. So this is based on some very recent data, just trying to give more input as to the impact of COVID. And the article on the bottom, published in Agricultural Systems, that was with a large group of co-authors. And here we look not only at fruits and vegetables, but we looked at different sectors in the agri-food system. But I'm going to focus on fruits and vegetables. So one question we might have is, how did total fruit and vegetable shipments change in 2020 relative to a normal year, right? And so in this slide, I'm going to put together shipments of carrots, lettuce, onions, oranges, potatoes, and strawberries together and show you this picture. And here we see for each of those 6 commodities, the shipments, the total shipments, and the shipments is sort of the total volume that that exists in the United States. So the lightest bar is this domestic production. Then there's some from abroad, the darker bits on top. And I think that the general message here is that by and large, these shipments, comparing 2019 to 2020, there wasn't a lot of change from 19 to 20, sort of looking at the entire year. There was a dip in orange production, orange shipments, but I think there's a side story there that's related to things over and above. COVID had some impact there, but that was over and above the impact from COVID. By and large, shipments were the same year over year. This slide kind of gets back to things that both the commissioner and Jim were talking about, and that's just that previous picture was just annual shipments, and that hides a lot of the variation from week to week. And so this picture, I feel, does a really nice job. Sorry about these. Economists love these spaghetti lines. I know they're, but I think this is a really nice story, and it sort of follows up on some of the things Jim and the commissioner was speaking of. So here we have potatoes, and we have potato shipments from two different places. Okay, and again, we're comparing 2019 to 2020. And on the top, we have a purple and a broken green line, and these are shipments from Idaho. And Idaho typically produces potatoes that enter the food service markets. And then on the bottom, the broken blue line and the yellow line, we have potato shipments that are from Colorado, and these are the potatoes that enter food retail markets typically. And along the bottom, we have these weeks of the year, and then we've drawn a yellow line, a vertical yellow line, to sort of describe about when that was about week 10 into the year, so the very start of March. And again, the top is Idaho, the bottom is Colorado. On the top, the broken green line is 2019, and the purple line is 2020. And what you can see is there is a very large disruption from the previous year in Idaho, where the shipments fall pretty drastically. They break away from that broken green line for about 6 weeks. And after that, for all these reasons that Jim and the commissioner were talking about, it seems that it got back to where it was back in 2019. And a very similar thing happened a little bit earlier in the cycle in Colorado, where you saw that major spike in the yellow line. These are the potato shipments in Colorado. These are going to food retail markets, to grocery stores. And there was this spike, but again, it kind of returned to normal levels or 2019 levels about 6 weeks later. So I'm not sure if 6 weeks is resilient. I'm not sure how we define resilient, but that seems like a pretty good story to me. Fairly resilient, coupled with industry response and government response. Here's one more picture I wanted to share with you. This is trade patterns for fruits and vegetables. Did this change in 2020? And so there's a lot of ways we could look at this. Trade, we heard a lot about how trade could be disrupted, because now we're going across borders and there's border issues and transportation issues. Here we're looking at monthly exports of fresh and processed fruits and vegetables that were produced, packaged in the United States and went to Canada. Again, comparing 2019 to 2020. So the blue bars are 2019, the red bars are 2020, month over month. And here you see, for the most part, the blue lines and the red lines are following the same pattern. They're about the same height, with the exception of, April, May, and June. The red bars, the 2020 values, for these are dollars, because we're compiling all fresh and processed together. This is in dollar terms. In dollar terms, trade from the United States to Canada had fallen in April, May, and June of 2020 relative to 2019. But again, you see by July, it was kind of back on track. That took a little longer than the 6 weeks that I showed you in the previous chart. But again, that shows to me that there is some resilience. This bounced back relatively quickly, perhaps more quickly than we might believe from some of the sources that are reporting on these things. And this is, this is based on official trade data between the United States and Canada. I think I could stop there if Jess.
Yes, I think that we should move on to the questions for the panel. Commissioner Ball, I have a question for you. Given that you are still involved in your family farm operation, can you share with us what's been your experience as a farmer during the past year?
Sure, but I can't do it in a half an hour. Well, first of all, I have to thank Jim and Brad for those very astute observations they made. I think that really rounded out kind of the scene that we saw last year in very real terms. For me on our farm, what I saw was immediately change. We need to change the way we do business. We don't need to change the way we grow things, the way we produce things, but we need to think differently about who our customer is, and how we're going to treat them. On our wholesale side, obviously, we saw our chefs, our restaurants, suddenly, and our brokers. We sold a lot to brokers who distributed to restaurants. That business just pretty much evaporated, as Jim pointed out, and Brad reinforced with those charts. So that changed. At the same time, we saw an almost initially an insatiable demand for food by our retail consumers, by our institutional consumers that took care of groups of people. Suddenly, homeowners and all kinds of folks were looking for, we all made fun of the toilet paper situation, but it was, how do I prepare foods at home? How do I cook bread? How do I find this? How do I find that? On our own farm, in our own community, we found ourselves, okay, we're going to deliver food to people who need it. And we had a world of people that were afraid to go outside, afraid to go to a grocery store, or went to a grocery store and bought everything on the shelves. We saw staples, potatoes and onions and apples, bread, milk. We saw a huge demand in our own community that we took care of. So we would take orders in a different way. Instead of having people visit the market, we saw people email an order and sit in a parking lot, wait for us to shop for them and bring it to them. We saw, obviously, across the state, Amazon and the Ubers and the ready-to-eat meals change. And for us, that picked up most of our institutional sales and restaurant sales in a different way. But we just had to adapt very quickly and figure out how we're going to stay alive here, and we'll do whatever it takes to get the food to where it needs to go. So that's what happened personally on our own farm.
Thank you for sharing. Can you comment about what crops that have been impacted during the pandemic in New York State in relation to production and distribution costs? Can you touch on any of those?
Sure. I think if you look at surveys that New York Farm Bureau has done, for example, you will find that virtually every farm in the state was affected somehow. Over 60% of them were affected in real economic terms. When you turn off the food service world, when you turn off the restaurant world, when you turn off the schools, who are a major source of nutrition and food for our young people, it's going to affect things. I think Jim pointed it out really well, and the redirecting and figuring out how to repackage and how to fit the need with the wrong size package. That got figured out after a while, a little bit. I think in terms of access to food, that got figured out a little bit to the food system with food banks and pantries participating. At the end of the day, I think an awful lot of our produce farms wound up in spite of the early scares, okay. I don't know how many people actually altered their planting schedules for the rest of the year. But I know a lot of our direct market farmers had very good years as people were drawn to the local food even more. We've seen over the last 20 years an interest in local foods. Our grocery stores are participating, our restaurants participating. When I go to the produce show and speak with Jim about my excitement in the industry, it's about connecting our New York consumers with New York produce and food. I think that, the New York Produce Show is a great example of international opportunities for us. It's our show. It's an international show. And the opportunity to connect New York growers with those opportunities is great. And I think we saw that in a big way. So I think over the 20 years that I've seen local food and the importance of it and the interest in it growing, if there's a silver lining to all of this, it's that New Yorkers became well acquainted with the vulnerabilities in the food supply chain and don't want to depend on another country, don't want to depend on another region for things that we need in the time of a pandemic.
So to that, are there any additional lessons learned from the pandemic, from the New York State Agricultural Department perspective in terms of responses to the pandemic, and hopefully no more pandemics, but in the future?
I think it really underscored something that probably all of us knew about the produce business, and that it's we talk about food, we talk about production, but we're in the relationship business. We need to know each other, and we need to understand each other's needs in terms of packaging and sizing. I think we've got some pretty neat opportunities going forward to think about. What Jim pointed out actually was, a lot of the packaging that went to the institutions, went to the food service world, wasn't appropriate for a family, wasn't appropriate for an individual. So how do we safeguard against that going forward? How do we make more shelf stable items, value-added things that could easily adapt to the food service world, could easily adapt to the food pantries, the food bank world, so they could address the need. So I think we have a lot of chances to build back better. I think we've got to learn a lot of lessons. This is part of that exercise right here. What did we learn? We're all talking about this, the new relationships. One thing that I think kind of gave us a little bit of a head start, and I think we'll continue to do that, is I remember my first day coming in as a commissioner, I attended a anti-hunger work group. I had been invited as a farmer. And by the time they had his first meeting, I was commissioner, and I walked in and sat there and looked at this hunger issue with a different lens on. And we had had a food policy council in the state for years, and the governor said, put these two together, have a hunger and food policy council. So we have farmers on this council, we have Farm Bureau on this council, we have all the state agencies that deal in food security on this council. We have all our food banks, and we have all our institutions that are in that world. And we already formed those relationships. That made it easy for us to react quicker than we ordinarily would have to the pandemic. And I think the importance of those relationships going forward, and the reliance and the things that the light kind of showed us when it got really bright on the food supply chain, is going to do nothing but help us as we go forward. We're going to have more of these discussions that you're holding here today. And we're going to have to get better acquainted with the issue. But I feel pretty optimistic that the fact that we are in a strategic place in New York with this marketplace and with the quality of growers, that we can connect the dots in an even better way.
Thank you, Commissioner. I have a question for Jim. Can you speak about the food service restaurant industry, and that you've already mentioned that they were impacted, and can you let us know what they might do for procurement as they continue to recover?
Sure. Thanks, Jess. You know, one of the big questions, and as the commissioner says, this is where we have to engage, is to determine what things have happened that are short-term problems that we've had to deal with in the pandemic, and what's really going to be a long-term change in our food system and supply things. We've certainly seen that some things have probably jumped 5 years. I think of the delivery services, the Uber Eats and things of this sort. They were all here. It wasn't that they were invented for the pandemic, but their growth rate was so dramatic during this year. The massive investments put into those options have really probably jumped them ahead 5 years, even assuming there's going to be a bit of a fall back as restaurants reopen and provide full service. I think it's likely that we're going to see a lot of restaurants actually revive and reopen. We're also going to see changes. Some people didn't make it through this, and that's sad, of course, but those spaces are still there, and there's still people who are looking for ways to grow businesses and serve the market. And to some extent, we've all been tied in so tight. I think you can have a roaring 20s kind of effect, which we had after the last great flu pandemic, that people are going to want to come out, go more, and the distribution systems are very resilient, even though they've been destroyed and many of them have looked to serve retail. They are really in a pouncing mode, ready to resupply restaurants as they open. So I don't anticipate there's going to be a big problem in that area. I think we're actually going to find great prosperity in the food service sector because people want to go out now. They've missed it. Yet there also will be some hesitancy. Some people are going to be scared of health issues for a long time to come. And some people have found solace in solitude and staying at home. So there will probably be some growth on the retail sector too. But I think the perspective is that the food system is going to be well positioned to supply a booming food service sector as the vaccines become widespread, prosperity comes to pass, and we move out of this pandemic.
We have a question from the audience that is asking about the other side. Are you aware of any thoughts on farms looking into the e-grocery industry? And they're asking, might there be increased interest in partnering with firms like Instacart? And if so, will these partnerships exist past the pandemic?
And the answer is there's tremendous interest. People are looking for ways, looking for new things. One of the things that happened was the big food service distributors often went into their own box programs and things, delivering directly to consumers all over the country. They were looking for new ways to move their products. It's also true the reverse happened because big distributors on food service stepped in to help retailers who didn't have room because they needed toilet paper and they needed 100 other things. And all of a sudden they went to outsiders and said, can you handle all our produce distribution? So companies in New York like Baldor on the Hunts Point Market, others went out and made deals with retail, use our trucks, use our facilities. We're here to help. It is nonetheless the case that there were reasons that the industry was organized the way it was before the pandemic, and those economics tend to drive things in the long term. So post-pandemic, although there will be obviously some changes and some people have found new customers and new ways to distribute, it's also true that the legacy of economics that drove people to buy things, say, through retail, have one big pickup place, one delivery, are probably going to also lead to prosperity for those traditional distribution techniques. But the world has changed. People have tried some new things, and there'll be a place for things that there wasn't before.
Jess, you are on mute.
Thank you. Bradley, I have a question for you. What longer impacts from COVID-19 do you see unfolding in the United States as it relates to the fruit and vegetable sales and production? And how might this experience impact consumer demand for fruits and vegetables, such as quality, whether it be local, organic, and niche products?
Okay. Yeah, I think I would follow up and echo some of the things that Jim and the commissioner noted. I think, and I also agree, this should be a time of optimism, for the marketing and the sales of fresh fruits and vegetables. I think Jim pointed to the experience after the last flu pandemic that we saw in the United States 100 years ago. I think you can also, to a different degree, you can also look to see how U.S. consumers, bounced back or responded to the Great Recession that happened in 2008 and 2009. There was also, to a smaller degree, but there was also this increase in, less people were spending money out at restaurants, especially fancier restaurants. There was more, a greater share of food dollars were being spent on food at home relative to food away from home. And there was a couple of trends even in that recent experience, not so recent experience, where, there was this shift towards more simple, more comfort foods. Among other subgroups of the population, there was evidence that as we purchased and prepared more food at home, some families, some households were shifting towards healthier, or they were thinking about food in a different way when they were preparing that much more food at home. And I think, to me, these seem like opportunities for sales and for marketing of fruits and vegetables, perhaps also for organic and local. Now that we're also spending more of our food dollars at food at home. So we're not spending those dollars in restaurants. And so some families have more spending capacity, more chance to be curious and to spend more money at the grocery store for this food at home, given that they're not spending so much money in restaurants. And I think that can be good for local products if people are just more curious. Could be good for organic products or other niche. Given that this is a webinar that's being hosted by the plant variety group at CTL, we're thinking about new cultivars, right, and new sort of niche products. I think it's could be a really good time for the launch or for the promotion of some of those. We're thinking about Ruby Frost as one example. That this is an opportunity to sort of re-highlight some of those products. The only other thing I guess I'd say in this space is this rise in online food sales. I guess it's not clear to me how what'll be the longer run impacts of, my mom's 75 years old. She never bought food online until March of 2020. And now she buys quite a bit of food online. Sometimes I try to ask her, does she buy things differently online? And I think fruits and vegetables, fresh fruits and vegetables, I think this could go either way, probably depending on the household. A lot of people like to see and touch and feel fruits and vegetables before they buy them. So that would mean that online sales could conflict a bit with fruit and vegetable purchases. But on the other hand, I think there's a lot of evidence that people buy healthier items when they buy food online. There's less of these impulse buys on the end of the cap type of purchases. And so I think in that light, online, in a further increase or continuation of these online sales could be good for fruit and vegetable sales. I expect Jim probably has some thoughts, and the commissioner probably has some thoughts on these sort of future looking issues as well.
Sure. The challenge actually is we have such an explosion of great new varieties all over the world in apples and grapes and many other products. And the challenge is marketing. one of the produce industry is not traditionally backed up by enormous advertising dollars and things like this. So how do you introduce these great innovative new varieties of apples, of grapes, and things like this? And we've traditionally relied on in-store sampling and things like this. So the great challenge for the produce industry looking ahead is, to the extent that procurement moves to online systems, how is the produce industry going to market these innovations? And that's not clear. There are all kinds of things. There are coupons. There are different ways we can do things. We can put videos up. We can do all kinds of interesting things, but we haven't really found the answer. But one answer may be that retail may change. In other words, those things that can clearly best be bought online. Who wants to carry around a case of water and put it in their trunk and all this? If you can buy those type of items all online, the very nature of what a supermarket is may change and be all about fresh foods and things like this, and give us an opportunity to promote our fresh fruits and vegetables from our growers right in person while they're buying their water and tissues and things like that online.
And I would just concur with all of that. I think that we have yet to see, some of the challenges being met with great optimism and good thinking. But I think I can assure you, and Jim and Brad, I'm thinking about the produce show, and I'm thinking about the coming together of growers and the coming together of the Eastern Produce Council and the Hunts Point Terminal Market and the Baldors, and the coming together of the retailers in one place. And I can assure you that every one of those people, their mind is on overdrive right now, thinking about, okay, what's the world going to look like? How are we going to supply those needs, and what fun and innovative ways can we use to deliver it?
Thank you all. Commissioner, and just in the last few minutes, we've got 2 minutes left here. Where do you foresee the department spending most of the time helping the fruit and vegetable actors in the overall supply chain?
Well, I'm kind of thinking 3 different things here. First of all, I'm thinking about marketing. I'm thinking about building our New York brand in a big way, because I think it's a great opportunity. We undertook a great rebuild of our marketing program in New York a few years ago at the direction of the governor and in cooperation with the Commissioner of Health, actually. New York Grown and Certified, and we've sponsored the produce show, and we've connected a lot of growers, and we've got a huge participation rate now amongst our growers. To get consumers to recognize the New York brand, why should they buy New York as opposed to anything else when they have so many options? And we're able to come forward with that brand and say, well, you've got, it's local, that because it's New York. We've embedded food safety in a gap audit on those farms that produce that product. And we've embedded environmental stewardship in that product. Those 3 things come together, and someone can see New York Grown and Certified and say, okay, it was grown in an environmentally responsible way. It was grown in safe methods, and it's New York. I think that's a good message. We're going to have to build on that even more as we go forward. We're going to spend a lot of time on access, because one thing I think we already knew with the hunger and food policy work, but what we saw highlighted pretty dramatically with COVID-19 was the issue of access, and certain neighborhoods and certain parts of our state that really suffered from supply. Some of our poorer neighborhoods, what used to be called and still are called, frankly, food deserts, getting the good food to good people in a timely manner. So with that, I know we're looking at, I was in the South Bronx 10 days ago, and we put a shovel in the ground at a new project just next to the Hunts Point Produce Market to build a new food hub. to engage with Grow NYC and to get the food box program ramped up in a bigger way and provide access to the people in those neighborhoods. Very exciting project. And right next door, of course, Hunts Point. I think Hunts Point has been an incredible partner for so many years, the largest terminal market. The needs there were huge as we went through COVID-19, and we're going to see that demand grow. So staying in touch with them, staying in tune with them, and the rebuild needs that we've known about for since 1960s when it was built. I mean, this isn't an old subject, but it's a new time to look at that subject and say, how do we make sure that the supply of food in the metropolitan area in particular is satisfied? So those are things I think we're going to spend a lot of time on. Just looking back at the food supply chain, how do we make sure this works and that we don't find ourselves struggling again if we face a similar situation?
Thank you, Commissioner. Well, our time's up for today. I thank all of our panelists for your time, and thank you all for participating.